There is something weird about Zenless Zone Zero, and the weird part isn't that it changed. Every live service game changes eventually, for better or worse. The weird part is that if you compare the story we have now to the story we had at launch, they barely feel like the same game. The protagonists are different, their role in the story is different, the kinds of conflicts the story focuses on are different. Even the feeling of the world is different. Normally when that happens, it is a problem. Actually, scratch that, usually it is a disaster. Because the stories are built on identity, the audience falls in love with a certain version of the story, and then one day the writers decide they want something else. That rarely ends well. But Zenless created a problem for me. Because the more it changed, the more I ended up liking it. Which doesn't make a lot of sense. There are parts of the original identity that I genuinely miss, parts that I think were unique, parts that I think the game never should have lost, and yet, I also think the story today is significantly better than the one we started with. So what exactly happened here? How do you lose part of your identity and still become a stronger story? And more importantly, was it actually worth the trade? When people talk about how much Zenless Zone Zero has changed, they usually jump straight to the things that were lost. The atmosphere, the smaller scale stories, the feeling that Wise and Bill were operating from the shadows. We'll get to that, but before we talk about the change that didn't work for everyone, I think we need to talk about the change that absolutely did. Because there is one part of the Proxy identity that evolved surprisingly well, and honestly, I don't think enough people give Zenless credit for it. At the beginning of the game, Wise and Bill were important because of what they knew. Their role was guidance, information, navigation. They were the people helping agents survive situations that should have killed them. That was their value, and it worked. It was different from most gacha protagonists. Most games start with a protagonist already standing in the middle of the action, or someone who is a self-insert and not exactly the protagonist. Zenless didn't. The proxies were important, but indirectly important. They mattered because they connected everyone else together. But here's the thing, a story can only keep a protagonist in that position for so long, especially a live service story. Eventually, the audience starts asking a question. If these are the main characters, when do they actually become part of the main conflict? And the interesting thing is that Zenless never answered that question all at once. It answered it slowly, piece by piece, update by update. The proxies kept getting pulled closer to the center, closer to the mysteries, closer to the forces shaping the world, closer to the danger itself. At first I thought this was just normal escalation, every live service game does it. The stakes get bigger, the world gets larger, the protagonist becomes more important, simple. Except, the more I sat with it, the more I realized something unusual was happening. The proxy identity wasn't being replaced, it was being expanded. That is a very important difference. Because if Wise and Bill had suddenly become traditional action protagonists overnight, I probably would have hated it. It would have felt like the game abandoning the thing that made them interesting. But that isn't really what happened. Instead, the story started treating their abilities as something worth exploring, worth developing, worth evolving. And that is surprisingly rare in gacha games. Think about how most protagonist progression works. Usually the protagonist gets stronger, maybe they unlock a new power, maybe they gain a new form, maybe the story tells us they've grown. But the actual process often happens in the background. The power itself rarely becomes part of the narrative journey. Zenless did something different. The Proxy's awakening is tied directly to their path through the story. Their growth is tied to the mystery surrounding them. Even the newest development, the fact that the Proxy is now playable, doesn't feel like a random decision. It feels like the next step, and that is why I ended up liking it. Not because it preserves the original version of the Proxy, it doesn't, that version is gone, but because it evolves from it naturally. The current Wise and Bill are very different from the people running commissions from behind a monitor at launch. There is no point pretending otherwise, but I can still see the road between those two versions. I can still follow the progression. The story did not wake up one morning and decide the proxies needed to become something else. It spent multiple updates building towards that change. And weirdly, that gave Zenless something I wish gacha stories had, a protagonist whose role actually evolves. Not just their strength, not just their importance, their role, the way they interact with the world, the way they interact with their own abilities, the way they fit into the story. That is fascinating to me, because when I look at where the proxies started and where they are now, I don't see a broken identity, I see an expanded one, a bigger one, a more ambitious one, and honestly, I think the game is better for it. But there is another side of being a proxy, and unlike this one, I'm not nearly as convinced that the change was for the better, because while the ability side evolved, the social identity of being a proxy might have disappeared altogether. The weird thing is that when people talk about Zenless Zone Zero feeling different today, I don't think they're usually talking about the ability side, at least not consistently. Most people aren't sitting there thinking, man, I really miss when Wise and Bell couldn't do any of this. If anything, a lot of players seem excited about where that part of the story is going. The awakening, the mysteries, the growing role of the protagonists, all of that has generally been received pretty well. So where does that feeling come from? Why do so many people still look at modern Zenless and say, this doesn't feel like the same story anymore? The more I thought about it, the more I realized the answer probably has nothing to do with what the proxies can do. It has to do with what being a proxy used to mean. Because there was another side to that identity, and honestly, I think this was the side that made Zenless feel unique. At the beginning of the game, being a proxy wasn't just a profession, it wasn't just a gameplay role. It was a social identity, a hidden one. That part matters. Wise and Bill weren't public heroes, they weren't celebrities. They weren't people openly participating in major political events. Most of New Eridu had no idea who Peyton actually was, and that created something really interesting. The protagonists lived two different lives. There was random play, the comfortable life, the neighborhood, the customers, the video store, the feeling that they were just two siblings trying to get through another day. Then there was Peyton, the underground identity, the illegal work, the dangerous clients, the hidden network operating underneath the city. Those two worlds constantly pushed against each other, and that's what gave early Zenless so much of its flavor. It wasn't just urban fantasy, it was secret urban fantasy. The city felt layered. Normal people saw one version of New Eridu, the proxies saw another. And every time the story crossed that line, it felt interesting. Not because the stakes were bigger, because the contrast was. That contrast is the part I kept coming back to. Not the hollows, not the combat, not even the mysteries. The contrast. The feeling that Wise and Bill occupied a place in the world that nobody else quite did. And when I look at the story now, that feeling is mostly gone. Not completely, but enough that it's hard to ignore. People know who they are, people know their proxies. The story treats that information much more casually. The line between random play and Peyton has become thinner and thinner over time, to the point where sometimes it barely feels like a line at all. And that's where the identity shift really happened. Not when the protagonists became stronger, not when they became more important, when the story stopped treating Proxy as a hidden identity. Because once that happens, the entire social role changes. Think about it this way, imagine Batman, not the gadgets, not the fighting, not the villains, the mask, the secret identity, the double life. Those things aren't just details, they're part of what Batman is. Now, could a writer create a version of Batman where everyone knows who he is? Sure, they could make it logical, they could make it make sense, they could probably even make it entertaining. But at some point, people would start asking a different question. Not, does this make sense? But, does this still feel like Batman? That's a completely different conversation. And I think that's where Zenless ended up. Because this isn't really a logical problem. The story can justify these things. Honestly, almost any story can justify almost anything if the writer wants it badly enough. That's not the difficult part. The difficult part is identity. Identity is a promise. When a story introduces itself in a certain way, it teaches the audience what kind of experience to expect. Early Zenless made a promise, not directly, not with dialogue, but through the way it presented the proxies, through random play, through Peyton, through the underground world, through the secrecy. It promised a very specific kind of protagonist fantasy, and that fantasy doesn't really exist anymore, at least not in the same form. Now, before someone misunderstands me, I'm not saying the current version is automatically worse. That's actually the question we're trying to answer. What I'm saying is that it is undeniably different. The social identity of being a proxy has changed more dramatically than the ability side ever did, and unlike the awakening, unlike the playable protagonist, unlike the evolution of their powers, this change doesn't feel like an expansion, it feels like a replacement. One version of the identity faded, another took its place. That doesn't automatically make it bad, but it does make it a gamble. Because once a story starts changing its identity, it stops being a question of logic. It becomes a question of value. What was lost? What was gained? And more importantly, was the trade actually worth it? Because that's where things get complicated. Normally, I would say changing a story's identity like this is a mistake. Usually that's a huge red flag. But Zenless isn't a normal story, it's a live service game. And weirdly enough, I think that changes the answer completely. So now we get to the part that surprised me, because normally I would not defend this. If you told me a story spent dozens of hours building an identity and then decided to change it halfway through, my first reaction would be concern. Identity matters. It is one of the strongest promises a story can make. When people fall in love with a story, they are not only falling in love with the plot, they are falling in love with its personality, its flavor, the specific thing that makes it feel different from everything else. And that is why I spend so much time talking about the social side of being a proxy, because I genuinely think something valuable was lost there. The hidden identity, the underground world, the contrast between random play and pattern, that was not just world building, that was part of Zenless Zone Zero's identity. So if that part was lost, why am I not calling this a mistake? Because the more I look at modern Zenless, the harder it becomes to argue with the results. At the end of the day, this was a gamble. Zenless traded part of its original identity for a different direction. The question is whether that direction produced a better story, and honestly, I think it did. When I look at early Zenless, I see a lot of good ideas, great characters, great atmosphere, interesting mysteries. But I also see a story that sometimes felt like a collection of separate pieces. Modern Zenless feels more unified. The protagonists feel like the center of the story. The major mysteries feel connected. The conflict feels like it's moving towards something larger instead of branching into unrelated directions. The story has a stronger spine than it used to, and that matters. Because once that foundation became stronger, everything else benefited from it. The protagonist became more compelling, the supporting cast became easier to revisit, the world started feeling less fragmented and more interconnected. And when I compare that to what was lost, I ended up in a strange position. Because I do think something was lost. I think the original Proxy identity was special. I think it gave Zenless a flavor that very few gacha games have. But I also think the current story is stronger than the one we started with. And that is why I cannot call this change a failure, not even close. Was it a risk? Absolutely. Did it make the game a little more conventional in some ways? Probably. But the gamble paid off, not because the old identity was bad, far from it, but because the new direction created a story that feels more focused, more cohesive, and more confident than what came before. So when people ask me whether Zenless Zone Zero lost part of its identity, my answer is actually pretty simple. Yes, I think it did. But I also think it gained something in return. And in this particular case, I think the trade was worth it. The funny thing is that this is not the first time I talked about identity on this channel. A lot of my favorite discussions end up circling back to the same question. What makes a story feel like itself? Not what makes it good, not what makes it popular, what makes it itself. And I think Zenless Zone Zero gave me an answer I was not expecting. Sometimes a story can change, sometimes it can leave part of its original identity behind, and sometimes that is exactly what allows it to become something better. That does not mean every story should do it, most probably should not, but Zenless took the risk, and somehow it worked, at least for me. But that's just how I see it. Do you think Zenless lost something important when it moved away from its original Proxy identity, or do you think the new direction is simply a natural evolution of the story? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, that's gonna be all from me for this one. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more stories discussions like this one. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.